The first time I heard one of my professors say that the Apostle Paul was a mystic, I immediately wanted to object. Sure, he saw visions, he spoke in tongues, he believed in his own revealed religious truths, but I didn't think of him as a mystic. I thought of Paul as a legalistic, misogynist, homophobic literalist who killed the message of Jesus by turning a message of love into a religion of guilt and fear. But at his core, Paul is arguably a mystic. Listen to how he describes his own conversion experience in his own words in a letter he wrote to the church in Corinth. I know a person in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up into third heaven, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that such a person, whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know, God knows, was caught up into paradise and heard things that are not to be told, that no mortal is permitted to repeat. Taken at face value, Paul's description of his mystical experience is actually not that much different from what we read from other mystics, even those who are Jewish or Buddhist or Hindu or Catholic. What we tend to call the unitive experience, a powerful but typically indescribable feeling of being united with God, a kind of personal epiphany. It's unique, but always indescribable. Just a sense of being in the presence of God. But a generation or two after Paul was dead, one of his fans, someone who certainly had never met Paul, described Paul's mystical experience this way in the book of Acts. Now he was going along and approaching Damascus. Suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? He asked, Who are you, Lord? The reply came, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But get up and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do. The men who were traveling with him stood speechless because they heard the voice, but saw no one. Saul got up from the ground, and though his eyes were opened, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. For 3 days he was without sight and neither ate nor drank. Now the writer of the book of Acts, in an attempt to make Paul seem to be more impressive, more important, takes his experience, which Paul says was entirely indescribable. Paul didn't even know if he was bodily being taken up into the skies or if it was just a visionary experience, and that he heard things that he either couldn't repeat or shouldn't repeat, saw things that he couldn't describe. But Luke, in what you have to say is a total work of fiction, concretizes Paul's experience and literally gives it a street address with a bunch of witnesses. He was on the road to Damascus. There was a blinding light. Jesus speaks to him audibly. Other people on the road also hear the voice. He gets specific instructions. Paul is blinded by the experience until he is healed by a Christian in Damascus. Now, those of you who grew up going to a Christian church probably remember this more concrete, fictionalized version of Paul's experience, and you may have no memory at all of his description of his mystical experience in 2 Corinthians. It's not that you never heard it, it's just that Luke's version has images. It makes it easy to remember. It creates a narrative, a kind of movie in your mind. Paul's own words, however, don't leave any muddy footprints on your brain. In fact, they don't appear to make much sense unless you've had a similar experience. And yet, that was Paul's honest account. The task before me today is to say something about demythologizing Islam. And I must apologize once again for using the Christian Bible for my opening illustration. But I trust that you can see how later generations, in a sophomoric attempt at polishing the credentials of a deceased saint, will try to add details that actually destroy the story rather than illuminating it. If you want to understand Paul, and mind you, I'm not suggesting that that would be a good use of your time, but if you do, you need to read the authentic letters that Paul wrote himself and try to ignore everything that was said about him in the book of Acts, which is, honestly, just a bit of propaganda aimed at pumping up Paul's resume. My only point in bringing Paul up is to say that something very similar happened to the founding prophet of Islam, the 6th century Arab reformer, Muhammad. Muhammad was born in 570 AD in the city of Mecca, which had long been a religious and spiritual center of the Arab world. He was orphaned at an early age and was raised by relatives who gave him exposure to the desert through the Bedouin Indian tribes that they sent him to live with at times, and then they would bring him back into Mecca to live in the city. So he was a product of his environment, influenced by the many Arab religions honored in Mecca, as well as Zoroastrianism, Judaism, and Christianity. He was, however, illiterate, and he depended upon his wife to read and write for him. She was older, she had some financial means, she had been a merchant. Muhammad, however, earned his living participating in the common practice of robbing caravans, the caravans that followed the merchant routes through what is now Saudi Arabia. But he kept up a practice of contemplation and isolation in a desert cave, part of his Bedouin upbringing. It is said that while in prayer in that cave, that he was visited by the angel Gabriel, who gave him messages from God. Muhammad memorized the messages and then dictated them to his wife. These writings became, for Muslims, the actual literal word of God collected in the Quran. However, like Paul, his initial experience in the cave was not quite so cut and dried. He had some kind of mystical experience, probably brought on by fasting and dehydration. But real or imagined, he certainly didn't call it a conversation with Gabriel. In fact, he panicked. Like most people of his era, he believed that the desert was inhabited by evil spirits called jinn. He believed that he had become possessed by an evil jinn, and he was considering suicide. In his distress, his wife Khadijah sent him to visit her cousin Waraqah, who was well versed in Hebrew and Christian scriptures. It was he who convinced Muhammad that his experience was not of an evil demon, but of the angel Gabriel. It was Waraqah who announced to Khadijah that Muhammad had been chosen to become the prophet of his people. Muhammad's progress, however, was actually rather slow. His own theology was evolving. The surah, or chapters of the Quran, are not organized chronologically. They're not from the first vision he had to the next, but rather they are organized loosely, not by topic, but generally from the longer to the shorter, which is the same way that Paul's letters are organized, because when you're writing on a scroll, you want to get your longest stuff down first before you run out of paper. But when you read them in sequence, if you can go back and discern which ones come first, it becomes evident that he started out with a more polytheistic worldview, and he evolved into being an adamant monotheist. His early and more poetic works were very similar to others in his culture, but he gradually grew into his own style. It should be clear that he had no intentions of starting a new religion. Jesus didn't either, Buddha didn't either, but his intention was to reform the faith of his peers and to unite the warring and embattled tribes around a single faith in one God, Allah. I have no reason to doubt Muhammad's sincerity, even if I do doubt his orientation to reality. I am reminded of what Scott Peck said about St. Joan of Arc. You might say that Joan of Arc was a schizophrenic, but you cannot say that she was merely schizophrenic. There was a greatness of character about Muhammad, even if he seemed to be somewhat delusional. He reinterpreted many Jewish and Christian narratives from his distinctly Arab perspective and elevated his followers to become confident of their own importance and the fact that God, who was generous, loved them. Though not neatly expressed in a succinct way in the Quran, Muslims everywhere from the time of Muhammad to the present acknowledge 5 fundamental pillars of what it means to be a Muslim. All 5 were already in practice before Muhammad. In Zoroastrianism, that required that their adherents pray 5 times a day, Judaism, which required fasting, Christianity, but Muhammad sharpens each of these 5 pillars and makes them distinctly monotheistic. The first is the declaration of faith. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is God's prophet. The second is the obligation to pray 5 times a day. Now, earlier in his career, Muhammad was telling people that they should pray 50 times a day, but it's hard to get converts that way, so he eventually got that down to what someone could actually do, which was 5 times a day. The third is a binding obligation to charity. Every good Muslim is supposed to donate to charity. The fourth is obligatory fasting during the month of Ramadan from sunrise to sunset. And the fifth is a requirement, if at all possible, to make a pilgrimage to Mecca, a Hajj. Sadly, religions always seem to become institutions. The 5 pillars are guides to living a life in surrender to God, in peace and harmony with others. However, religions are rarely simply a belief system. They become identified with an ethnicity, sometimes even with a government, an authoritative and a competitive view of the world. And as an institution, religions become inflexible and oppressive. Westerners are awfully deeply offended by the way that many Muslim women are expected to, or they choose to, cover themselves entirely in a burqa, or almost entirely with a headscarf, along with all of the debates about whether a woman should be allowed to drive a car or travel alone. I get that. I find that to be offensive. However, while we accuse them of absurdly repressing the sexuality of women, they are not wrong to point out in return that Westerners go to the horrible extremes on the other end of the spectrum, pushing women to be objects of constant sexual exploitation. I don't think you can defend either one of those positions on either extreme. In fact, it often seems that our cultures cannot seem to find a sane center between pornography and Puritanism. But clearly, we cannot say that Islam is alone in being wrong on this point. As with other world religions, even though Islam is the most modern of the major religions, it is still mired in myth and superstition. Obviously, Muhammad did not split the moon, nor did he ride a winged horse or mule to Jerusalem and then to heaven to meet Adam, Moses, John the Baptist, and Jesus, as well as God. And more importantly, Gabriel did not dictate the contents of the Quran to Muhammad. Islam is a human invention, just like all of the other religions of the world. And like all of the other religions, there are good things about being a Muslim, and there are things that are in desperate need of reform. Although about 20% of the world claims to be Muslim, we associate the religion the most closely with the governments and peoples of the Middle East. That's not accurate. The largest Muslim population is in Indonesia. However, holding on to the myths associated with certain holy sites and disputed real estate claims, primarily focused on Israel, but not exclusively so, keeps leading the Arab and Western worlds into bloody confrontation. This year, the Muslim observance of Ramadan coincided with both Easter and Passover, when the Temple Mount in Jerusalem is so packed with pilgrims from all three faiths that tensions quickly become incendiary, with the same old stories of Palestinians throwing rocks at Jews and Christians, and then the Israeli police overreact. Palestinians carry with them a huge burden of rage left over from centuries of colonization from European powers, which has only been made worse by the land theft that Europe participated in to create the State of Israel in the early part of the 20th century, and the way in which Israel confines and oppresses the Palestinians within their borders. So sure, there's agitation from the Palestinians every year, rock throwing, stabbing. And I've personally been on the receiving end of threats and a shoving match in the Palestinian quarter of Jerusalem when some young boys in the early 1980s assumed that because I was an American that I was a supporter of Ronald Reagan. I was saved only by being able to convince them that I hated Ronald Reagan more than they did, which I did. Let me know if you want further details. Still, even though there is Palestinian agitation, at the end of every season of conflict, the casualty count is always 10 to 1 of injured Palestinians over injured Israelis. There is fault on both sides, but it is not an equal situation. It may not be that the Israelis hold all the cards, but it looks like they start out every hand holding 3 aces. There are those in the Muslim community who insist that the word Islam actually means peace. I'm anything but an Arabic scholar, but I know enough to know that that is not true. Islam means surrender, as in a total surrender to God. But the net effect is to say that Islam should be a religion of peace. And while the overwhelming majority of the world's 2 billion Muslims are peace-loving, decent people, they are not the Muslims we hear about in the news. We hear about Muslim terrorists who attack the West and Muslim factions who fight with each other. You really can't blame all of the internecine fighting in Islam. You can't blame terrorism on the religion. There are, as I've mentioned, centuries of old colonial resentments and anger about cultural domination of Western fashions, products, music, movies, and language, all of which threaten their culture with extinction without ever even mentioning all of the Western military bases on their land, which is a source of constant irritation. And the fighting between major factions of Islam, the Sunni, the Shia, and the Kurds, which at times is religious, but it's also racial, and it's geographical, and it is financial. Our nation's longest wars have been in Afghanistan and Iraq, and neither of them, in my opinion, are the major global offenders. Forgive me if I'm talking above my pay grade here, but in my opinion, Saudi Arabia, the home of Mecca and Medina, is the worst about exporting both terrorism and causing the internecine battles among Muslim states. They export the most extreme form of Islam, Wahhabism, with all of its insistence on a literal interpretation of the Quran and militance against anyone who differs with them. There is no pretense of a separation of church and state in Saudi Arabia. Their flag contains the Muslim confession, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is God's prophet. But there is also a sword, and the sword is not merely symbolic. We are focused right now on the war crimes and genocide of Russia in Ukraine. And people like me have been decrying the kids in cages on the border between the United States and Mexico and all of our mistreatment of immigrants. But all the while, year after year, the Saudis maintain a practice of public beheading of criminals with a sword. In March, just 6 weeks ago, the Saudis beheaded more than 80 men in a public execution, and more than half of those men were from the minority Shia population. The Saudis had labeled them as terrorists, but I'm afraid their only act of terrorism was that they were Shia and not Sunni. This is barbarism at an intolerable level, and it goes on year after year after year, while they remain in the good graces of oil-burning Western democracies. In fact, right now, while we're trying to get people to stop buying crude oil from Russia, we are sending emissaries to Saudi Arabia asking them to pump more crude out of the ground. If I may say it plainly, this is hypocrisy, and it must stop. I'll be speaking to this issue more fully in June. I know you can hardly wait to hear it, but as Soren Kierkegaard wrote, this must be said, so now let it be said. And I'm saying it's up to me, and I'm not waiting past June. The 2018 torture, murder, and dismemberment of the American journalist Jamal Khashoggi is all of the evidence we should need to say that this flavor of violent Islam must be reformed. And in spite of Donald Trump's defense of the Saudi prince, the civilized world must stop looking the other way. You cannot claim this is not, in important ways, connected to Wahhabism, and this cannot stand in the modern world. I believe that the execution of prisoners is always wrong, whether it's in Missouri or Texas or Saudi Arabia. But public execution by beheading, that's taking pride in it, pride in a violent and cruel execution, and we should all be outraged by this policy. And it should be obvious that if I tried to deliver this sermon in Saudi Arabia, I would be beheaded. Islamic scholars will insist that this is not true Islam, and I agree. But the religion that promotes peace needs to be a part of the obvious reform that must happen in Saudi Arabia. I'd like to conclude this series on demythologizing religion by quoting once again the famous scholar Karen Armstrong, who said, "If your understanding of the divine makes you kinder, more empathetic, and impels you to express sympathy in concrete acts of loving kindness, this is good theology. But if your notion of God made you unkind, belligerent, cruel, or self-righteous, or if it led you to kill in God's name, that is bad theology. The 21st century must be the century when good religion takes the stage as we usher all bad religion into the pages of a dark and shameful past."
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.